Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon in partnership with the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. My name is Olivia Collins, and I'm the Director of Programs for the CLEO Institute. And I'm joined today by Lisa Fernandez, who's the Associate Director for the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and Ruthie Gold, who's a consultant for the program. For those of you who are not familiar with the CLEO Institute, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with an office in Miami, Orlando, and Tallahassee, and we are entirely dedicated to climate change education, engagement, and advocacy. And when we're not all stuck at home and doing online webinars, you'll often see CLEO in the community doing trainings and workshops, helping people connect the dots on climate change and helping them understand how to become advocates in their community and take climate action. When we first began developing this webinar, we had educators in mind, and that's because CLEO has two particular programs that are aimed at teachers and informal educators. The first one is the CLEO Teachers Network. Every year in the fall, CLEO offers a professional development training to teachers to help them understand how to integrate climate change across their curriculum, regardless of the subject that they teach. And we also offer a quarterly newsletter for all of our teachers that provides information, relevant resources that they can also use in the classroom. If you'd like to sign up for the CLEO Teachers Network newsletter, I'll be posting the links in the chat. If you can't access them in the chat, you can access them on our website, and every participant today will also get a follow-up email that will contain all of this information. The other program that CLEO has is the CLEO Speakers Network. This program is open to anyone. The goal of this program is really to equip citizens with tools so they can become climate speakers themselves and amplify the climate change message to a wider audience. We just recently closed our current online cohort registration, but we will be offering more cohorts throughout the year. Again, I'll be sharing this link in the chat if you're interested in signing up and learning more, but you can also go onto our website under our programs tab and find out more about these two programs. So before I begin, I just want to take a second to acknowledge we are really in unprecedented times, and I know that everyone is coping in a different way, so really appreciative of all of you who are on the webinar today. But also, it's a privilege for CLEO to be able to offer these extra online learning opportunities to make sure that we stay connected as a community. So before further ado, I will let Lisa Fernandez take over. Lisa?
Great. Thank you very much, Olivia. I really appreciate this opportunity to connect with folks who are, whose profession it really is to educate the next generation. And it truly is a privilege to be partnering with you, CLEO, and to meet the rest of you who are out there on the front lines educating these students and explaining climate change to them. And I also just want to take this moment to acknowledge these unprecedented times, as Olivia said, and thank you so much for carving out a little time out of your day to think about climate change. So let me share my screen. Is that okay, Olivia?
Go for it one more time.
Okay, I will try now. There we go. Okay. So is that full screen now?
Yeah.
Great. So before I even start, I just want to have people think a little bit about what is the first word or phrase that comes to your mind when you hear the term global warming, or if you want to use the term climate change, that's fine instead. Just think about that for a couple of seconds and hold that in your head while I speak a little bit about what we do. We consider the science of climate change as completely settled, and we're much more interested than in how it's understood, perceived, and talked about in American society, and actually in other countries around the world as well. And so we've always asked this open-ended question in the twice yearly surveys that we conduct. this exact same question that I've just asked you, and I'm going to just present what Americans overall think when we ask them about climate change or global warming. What they say, generally, the topmost answer is that they're skeptical about it. They don't believe it. Many think it's a hoax. Many think that it's completely a political scam. Other people have accepted the doubt that has been generated about it by very well-funded organizations that are funded by the fossil fuel industry and by political leaders in our society from both sides of the aisle, but who tend to be more on the conservative end of the spectrum. And so these messages have been very powerful and have sowed a lot of doubt about the reality of climate change in our country. The second top response we get is melting ice. This, of course, conjures images of something that's very far away that certainly has nothing to do with the state of Florida, except that perhaps, you know, you might have some melting ice cubes in your cold drink at any time of year down there. And also of polar bears, which are not exactly a species that's very proximate to folks in Florida or actually anywhere in the continental United States. And of course, the problem with those kinds of images and those kinds of framed understandings of climate change is making it very far away, distant in time and space. And that's very problematic because if you think something is very far away and isn't relevant to your daily life, it's much less likely that you're going to be motivated to take action about it. So we're really all about communication and coaching the voices of people like you who are interacting with the public, with students on a daily basis. And we want to help your voices to be as effective as possible. So what that means is we want to understand how the public thinks about climate change. And that's why we conduct these surveys every year. And we've been doing so for more than the past decade. And so the next slide is really a vast simplification of our findings, and our surveys map onto these 5 facts in 10 words. And so I'd like to go through those with you. The first fact, climate is real. And what we find in our surveys when we ask the question, do you think global warming is happening? We now find that about 7 in 10 Americans say that it is real. 72% to be precise, as you can see right here. So the second fact, it's us, it's human caused. We find that, again, a majority of people get that it is caused by largely fossil fuel emissions in modern society. And you can see that in our latest survey of November of last fall, that we get to almost 6 in 10 Americans understanding and accepting that global warming is human caused. This hasn't necessarily been the case that we've had a majority. If you look backwards over time, you can see that occasionally, you know, that's dipped a fair amount. So third fact, global warming is harmful. We don't ask that question directly, but we use as a proxy how worried people are about it. So when we ask the question, how worried are you about global warming? We find again that about 70% of Americans are worried, and about 3 in 10 or 30% in our latest survey of last fall are very worried about global warming. And those, as you can see, that dark green bar has gone up over the course of the years that we've conducted the survey. And that makes sense. Climate change, more and more people are connecting the dots between climate change and weather, for example. And that's been particularly the case, perhaps, down in Florida with the increasing severity of hurricanes and sea level rise, as we'll discuss later on in the program. So what about this? The fourth fact is that there's a very, very dominant scientific consensus that global warming is happening and that it's human caused. And as you can see in the left-hand pie chart, 97% of climate scientists agree on these facts. But there's a huge disparity in the perception of the American public, right? Not even quite half of Americans accept that global warming is happening and human caused. And a little more than half say they don't know. So this is potentially, or actually is a problem, because Americans trust scientists tremendously. And if they feel that there's scientific disagreement about this issue, they're going to be much less motivated to take action on it in their own lives. They're like, well, the science isn't settled. And this goes back to the tremendous success that naysayers have had in selling doubt about this scientifically accepted fact of global warming. So finally, the fifth fact is that there is hope about it. And I know this is kind of a complicated figure, but if you just look at the little square on the lower right, you can see that 42%, 4 in 10 conservative Republicans who are registered to vote agree, for example, that it makes sense to require electric utilities to produce at least 20% of their electricity from renewable energy, okay? Non-carbon emitting kinds of energy production. So just some more on hope. We find generally that Americans who remain hopeful, and we ask questions about this in our surveys about this subject, are more likely to say that they'll take action on global warming than those who say they're not hopeful. So that's a positive sign. And one thing that's particularly relevant for the education community is that we have asked this question about support for educating children about global warming in schools, and we find that there's a very strong majority of Americans that support this idea that yes, students should be taught about global warming in school. So thank you for doing what you're doing about that right now. Another thing I'd like to mention is this concept of a climate spiral of silence. This is a commonly studied phenomenon in social science, this idea of a spiral of silence that has to do with what you perceive may be a norm about a particular issue and feeling either empowered or disempowered from talking about it with your friends. And so the idea with global warming is that people may be alarmed themselves or concerned themselves about global warming, but their perception commonly is that their friends don't care that much about it. So they're shy to bring it up as a topic of discussion. And what that means, of course, is that, you know, if you're not talking about it, you're not learning about it, and you're not taking action on that issue. So in general, what we found, if you look at this trend line, is that, you know, more people are talking about it, but still not a majority. And most are rarely or never talking about global warming with their family and friends. So this again is concerning. And so it's particularly important to be empowering students in the context of school to be learning about it and talking about it. And finally, just one further point that we really won't discuss too much more, but nationwide, there are of course lots of different demographic groups. And we've been able over the course of our surveys to look at what particular groups of people think and do about climate change. And one salient finding is that Latinos and Hispanics, if you want to call them, are generally much more concerned and alarmed about climate change than other groups. And this is also true for African Americans. So whites are generally the least concerned and Hispanics and Latinos the most concerned, and also concomitantly the most willing to take action and even join campaigns to address global warming. And this is relevant, of course, in Florida, where there are many, many Latinos and also Spanish-speaking Latinos. And at some other point, we can talk more about the work we've done in particular with those communities. So I'd like to, just before turning this over to Ruthie, who's going to be supervising the interactive portion of this presentation, I want to just go through this segmentation that we've done of Americans into 6 different groups based on their attitudes about global warming. And we call this is our signature product, you might say, Global Warming 6 Americas. It's kind of similar to what, you know, Coke might do in the marketing domain to figure out different strategic audiences and how to best promote Coke with those different kinds of audiences. So we find that there are 6 different groups. The first group is called the alarmed, and they're very certain that global warming is happening. They're very sure also that it's caused by human activity and that it's harmful. they're doing already a lot in their own lives to address it, and they want to do more. And this is what their question is. They want to know what else they can do. They're also, just to say, politically active generally. They'll call their congresspeople, for example, and they're going to engage in other forms of activism, both as individuals and as households. And they're the ones that are talking about it. Next, we have the concerned. Like the alarmed, they certainly accept the reality of global warming. They understand that it's harmful, but they tend to perceive it as a more distant issue that's not relevant to their own daily life. And what that means, of course, is that while they might take some actions to address it, to increase their energy efficiency, for example, in their home, they're not going to probably engage too much in being politically active around it. And they're not going to talk about it as much. The cautious, they're a little bit what we like to call fence-sitters. They're not certain about global warming. If they accept that it's happening, they might say, well, you know, it's natural cycles. They definitely perceive it as a distant problem, and they don't really have a very strong personal agenda about it, making changes in their own lives. And they just don't think about it all that much. Next, we have the disengaged. They want basic information. They have a lot of other priorities in their lives that they're thinking about and concerned about, and global warming is just not among the priorities that they are thinking about or worried about, and they just don't think too much about it. We have also the doubtful. This is the fifth group. If they accept that global warming is real, they're pretty pronounced in their belief that it's not caused by humans and that it is a natural cycle. And they tend to be more conservative and religious, and they're pretty well educated. Finally, we have the dismissive. This group is almost like the opposite of the alarmed and is very similar to the alarmed in many ways, in the sense that they're quite educated and they're very motivated to take action, but against political or policy action on global warming. And they will write to their congressmen, they'll comment on websites, they're thought leaders in this space, although they're against taking action. And they tend to have a very coherent and strong agenda that they have money behind them to promote. So given that you have a little bit of a sense of who these 6 Americas are, Ruthie's going to take you through an exercise about what your guesses are as to what percentage of the American population is dismissive about global warming. So I think you're going to conduct a poll, is that right? Or maybe just in the chat. And then you're going to take the poll, actually take the survey yourself to figure out what this group, how this group breaks out in the global warming 6 Americas.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I just unmuted. So welcome everybody once again. Thanks so much, Lisa, for that wonderful intro, and for Olivia and the rest of CLEO for hosting us today, and for all the participants who are here showing up in these very, very crazy times. So actually, what we'll do is we'll start with by thinking about the percentage of Americans who are dismissive about climate change. And then what I'm going to do with you afterwards is actually take you through 3 of our resources or tools and model a bit how you can use those tools with students either in your classroom or in this age of virtual learning online. So what I will ask you to do is to just think about for yourself, what percentage of Americans do you think feel dismissive about climate change? And Olivia actually has a poll where you can actually select your answer. So again, what percentage of the American population is dismissive towards climate change? So I'll give everyone a moment to respond to that. And Olivia, whenever you see that there are a lot of responses, we can take a look, see what we think.
All right.
All right, interesting. Okay, so 14% of us think that 10% of Americans are dismissive. Most of us, 50%, think that 23% of the American population is dismissive. And then we see the 47% and 72%. So let's hold on to that for just a moment. And I'm going to launch into showing you how to use the first of our resources or tools. And this will play out in just a moment. So I'm going to now share my screen with you. And just as a kind of, not a warning, but just so we know, I will be going through these things a little bit on the faster side, but we are hoping to have time for a bit of a Q&A at the end. We also will be sending out links to our tools afterwards, so no need to be scrambling to copy down all the long URLs or anything. So as Lisa discussed, there are 6 attitudes that you can have towards climate change: alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. And what we've developed is actually a 4-question multiple choice survey that will at the end tell you which one of these groups you fall into. And we call that our 6 Americas quiz. So I'm going to show you on my share screen how you would do this on your own, and then we're actually all going to kind of take it together. This is a really great tool to use as kind of a benchmark with your students. It's something you can administer really quickly at the beginning of a climate change unit or a climate lesson, and then again at the end to see maybe how students' beliefs have evolved over the course of that unit or lesson. So if you were just to take it on your own, you would just scroll here and click the Take the Quiz button. And then there's also a group scoring tool, which is what's really going to be useful if you're thinking about using this with a group of students. What we've done, actually, we have arranged for you all to take this quiz. You just got the bit.ly link in the chat that will take you to a Google survey version of this 4-question quiz. So you can either copy and paste that link, that bit.ly link in the chat, to your internet browser, or you can just type it in to your browser, and that again should take you to that survey. So if you haven't already, please do that now. Take that 4-question survey, and then we're going to get to see our data. And I see a lot of results coming in, which is awesome. Wait another minute or so. So you can see it really doesn't take very much time at all to do. All right, let's take about 30 more seconds. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with you once more. So here we are back on our 6 Americas tool. And with the data that you guys just submitted to me, since it was a Google survey, it automatically fed into this Google spreadsheet. We're going to come back to that in a second. So now I'm going to show you a bit about this group scoring tool, which is what you might want to use with a class. So essentially, if you did want to do that, you would download a spreadsheet using this link, and it essentially looks the same as this Google survey sheet, okay? And then what you'd be able to do is input all your students' data on that spreadsheet that you downloaded and then re-upload it here. So I'm just gonna download ours. And again, this is all of our data. And then I'm just gonna click and drag it and drop it right here. And we have all of our data for you guys. So as well as this being a very great benchmark tool to use with your students, it's also a really great opportunity to have students practice reading and interpreting data and graphs and analyzing data. It's definitely heartwarming to see that we're all alarmed. But you know, with different groups of people, you might see different data. You see it here, we've got it represented as a pie chart. We've got our raw numbers here. And as well as seeing the data represented in these ways, we've also got how our own group's data compares to the rest of America, which is pretty neat. And this could be a little more engaging for students in terms of data analysis and interpretation, because it's their own data that they would be doing this exercise with, which is always a perk to make that relevant, really hit home. So that is one way to use our 6 Americas. I'm just going to go through a couple more ways in which you can use this resource. So thinking back to that poll question that we took initially and thinking about what percentage of Americans are dismissive about climate change, you can definitely ask your students this. And then if you show them this graphic, they can actually confirm their predictions or see how their predictions might not match. So actually, those of you who said that 10% of Americans are dismissive about climate change, you're right. So it's actually a very small percentage of the country as a whole. And this is as of November 2019. From here, you can have a really interesting discussion about the implications of what students thought versus what the reality of the data actually is. Here's another graphic that's good for practice with data analysis and reading graphs. This is trends over time of American attitudes from 2014 to 2019. Lastly, there are also several additional studies that we've done on these 6 audiences. A lot of them also have great graphs, charts, things like that, to again practice those data analysis skills. One study that I particularly like is this Message Strategies for Global Warming 6 Americas. And this talks all about effective ways of communicating with people based on which of those 6 groups they fall into. So this could be a really great jumping off point for an exercise like a role play where one student is pretending that they are dismissive and another student is pretending that they are cautious, and have them engage on a climate change issue. This could also be easily transformed into a written activity. Students could write a script or a story or a PSA or a cartoon, practicing communication and dialogue and debating. So these are just a few ways in which you could use this tool. And I think that's it for this one. So I'm going to move on to our next tool, which is our Yale Climate Connections. And this tool is really fantastic. It houses 5 years worth of our daily 90-second podcasts about climate change. So you heard that correctly. Every single day we are producing a podcast about climate change that's only 1.5 minutes long. So this could be a really wonderful way to bring climate change into your classroom as a do now activity, or if you have 5 or 10 minutes left at the end of a class, or a Fun Friday podcast. You can see there's also other media as well. So we've got articles, we've got analysis pieces, but these audio clips, these 90-second podcasts are really the gem of this site. There are several ways in which you can search for podcasts. So you can come up to the topics here and you can see that this is a really wonderful way to connect to climate change, not only through the science lens, but across all content and multiple content areas. So we've got arts and culture related to climate change, food and agriculture, health, religion and morality. So this could be a really wonderful access point for students and for teachers as well, who maybe aren't as confident in the hard science aspects of climate change. If you're thinking, or if you're looking for something very specific, you can just come over here to this magnifying glass and search by keyword. So let's say I want to search podcasts that are related to students. I'll just type that in. And we get 309 results, so that's a ton. And I'll slowly scroll through some so you can see the variety, the sheer variety of types of podcasts that we have just related to students. So this can be extremely empowering for students learning about climate change, and really important in building that sense of self-efficacy and hope as well. Another way in which we can search is if we come to radio program, go to story locations, stations map, you'll see that we've got an interactive map here. Forgive my slow Wi-Fi, but here we've got an entire map of the United States showing where all of our stories are coming from. So you can see that stories are coming from all over the United States and actually all over the whole world, which is pretty incredible. So you can search stories by location too. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna model a way in which you can use this with your students. I'm actually going to find a podcast that is from the state of Florida. I know we're not all from Miami and Miami Beach, but I did find a good one from Miami Beach that I would like to play for you. And if you give me a moment while I find it, what I'll do is I'm going to show you some discussion prompts that you could use with students really easily. And then I'll play the podcast. And then I think what we're going to do is have an opportunity to use that chat function to discuss those prompts. So first I'll just show you what it looks like to navigate to one. So I clicked on one of those blue microphone icons and you'll see the title comes up, a subtitle, and then a link to the podcast itself. So here's where you'd press play to play the podcast. Also, something that's really great that I love about this site in particular is that the transcript of the podcast is here too. So if you're using this with students, students can have something tangible to read along with as they're listening to the podcast. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment so that I can copy and paste the discussion questions here. Okay, so I just copy pasted the discussion prompts into the chat box. I'll read them out loud before playing the podcast for you. So Valerie Navarrete is determined to stay in her home of more than 20 years despite rising sea levels and flooding. What do you think of her decision? If you were in her position, would you stay? Why or why not? And then the second prompt is, have you or has someone you know had a similar experience to Valerie's? If so, what was it? So I'm going to share my screen once more so I can play that podcast for you and be thinking about those prompts.
I'm Dr. Anthony Lazowitz, and this is Climate Connections. In Miami, sea levels are rising, and residents have noticed.
The water is here. It's not that I'm talking about some sci-fi movie here. No, I live it. I see it. It's tangible.
That's Valerie Navarrete. She's lived in South Beach for more than 20 years. About 7 years ago, sea level rise, a high tide, and rain combined to cause a major flood.
I remember it was a Friday afternoon and it was raining for about 1 hour. When we came out, our garage had over 3 feet of water, not inches, feet. So we lost several cars. It's just unbelievable.
Navarrete's garage now floods about once every other month. She often has to wear rain boots just to get to her car.
And sometimes the water would be higher than that, so I couldn't wear my boots because otherwise I would get the water inside the boots. So then we have to go barefoot, which is disgusting.
And when the moon, earth, and sun align, tides are even higher than usual. They're called king tides and last for about a week. During king tides, Navarrete's garage floods twice a day. But Navarrete is determined to stay, even if it means that her rain boots become a permanent fashion statement. Climate Connections is produced by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication.
All right, so let's take a look at those prompts again. I'll read them one more time. Valerie Navarrete is determined to stay in her home of more than 20 years despite rising sea levels and flooding. What do you think of her decision? If you were in her position, would you stay? Why or why not? And the second prompt, have you or has someone you know had an experience similar to Valerie's? If so, what was it? So I'm going to give you the opportunity now to use that chat function to type in what your response is to either one or both of those prompts, and I'll read out some of them as they're coming in. Just make sure that your settings for the chat are to all panelists and attendees.
If anyone's having issues finding the chat, you can scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see the little chat icon, which has a little speech bubble and 3 ellipses. You can click on that and it should bring up the chat box for you.
Don't be shy, everybody. Thank you, James. Thank you, Carol. So James is comparing Valerie's experience to people in Australia who've also suffered environmental impacts of climate change. Others are saying that they would leave. Juan would demand to the government to implement programs focused on climate change adaptation, so that people don't have to leave, perhaps. Yeah, these are great. Thank you, everybody. And so you could see how if we were in a classroom setting or in an in-person setting, how we could have students divided up into small groups, discussing these prompts, and people connecting to other parts of the world in El Salvador, having similar experiences. Catherine brings up the good point that moving is also a challenge, as well as the challenge of living in a place that is affected by climate change. Fantastic. Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to ask this question to people living in various places across the United States, because I'm sure that they've had similar experiences, maybe with different types of natural disasters, so like drought and wildfire in California, but I'm sure there are a lot of similarities across the country and across the globe. Let's close off the commenting for now, so just so we can move on, keeping an eye on the time. But again, you can see how really easily in a classroom you could divide students into groups to discuss these prompts, come back together as a class to have a full class discussion. You could also have this as a written reflection activity. You can even have students in groups, and each group have a different podcast to listen to and kind of jigsaw the sharing of these different podcast radio programs. So thank you all again for your participation with that. We're going to now move on to our last resource that I'm going to walk you through today. It's called our Yale Climate Opinion Maps. But before we do that, I'm actually going to start this one by modeling the activity that you can do with your students, or one activity you could do with your students as it relates to this. And it's going to start with another poll question. So Olivia is going to give you the first of 2 poll questions now. So what percentage of people in Florida do you think believes that global warming will harm them personally?
Almost done here.
All right.
Okay, I've ended the poll. I'm going to share the results.
All right, let's see. Okay, so the majority of us in the group think that 55% of people in Florida believe that global warming will personally harm them. Actually, the answer is 43%. 43% of people in Florida believe that global warming will harm them personally. Okay, so keep that in mind. 43% of people in Florida believe global warming will harm them personally. Olivia is now going to administer a second poll question. So do you think that this percentage, that 43%, is higher or lower than the national average?
All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
All right, so most of us think that this is higher than the national average. Awesome, thank you, Olivia. So we are going to now explore and find out the answer to that question ourselves using our last tool. So I'm going to share my screen with you once again, and I'm going to take you to our Yale Climate Opinion Maps. So this is going to be, in a moment when it loads, here we go, a map of the United States of America. And it basically provides us with all of this data and information about how people's beliefs around climate change, risk perceptions around climate change, policy support around climate change varies across different regions of the country. So in order to find the answers to our questions, we're going to select the question here. So global warming will harm me personally. That's what we were focused on. And right now this is showing county responses, but since we asked about the state as a whole, I'm just going to click states. And then I'm going to come here, run my mouse over the state of Florida. So global warming will harm me personally, 43%. That's how we got the answer to that first poll. And most of you were correct. That is higher than the national average, not by much, but by 1 full percentage point. Floridians believe more that global warming will harm them personally than the rest of the country on average. I saw that someone had noted that, you know, if we had only focused on counties in South Florida, their answers might be different. And that is a great point. And this is a model that we can manipulate to actually see that. So if we go back to counties, we are able to see that Miami-Dade County, that value is much higher. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. You can ask students these sorts of questions. You can select any of these questions. You can do multiple, what have you, and then have them actually come and navigate through this model, work with this model to confirm or refute their own predictions. And from there, you can do a number of great things. You can have students compare data across counties, across states, across congressional districts. You can also have students take ownership over their own data once again and actually administer a survey of their own to people in their school or community members or their families and see how the data that they collect stacks up against the data that we have about their county or their state, etc. This is just if we scroll down the data presented in a little bit of a different way. So this is nationwide as of 2019. 67% of people believe that global warming is happening. 16% of people do not believe that. So again, just another way of presenting the data, another way to practice with your students reading and interpreting charts and graphs. One more thing that I'll show you is this climate opinion fact sheet. And this uses the same data as from the Yale Climate Opinion Map. It's just a different way of looking at it in perhaps a more digestible way. So we can select by state. So we'll do Florida again. And We could select by county or congressional district. I won't for now, but you can. And then you can select all the questions that you would like on your fact sheet. I'll just leave it as is for now. And then I'll generate the fact sheet. And so you can see that it's a really nice clear-cut way of seeing data about the particular region that you're really trying to get at. Again, maybe just a little more approachable than that whole map of the United States. So that is how we can use a lot of our tools with students, both in the classroom and virtually. I'll just, before a Q&A, I'll show you one more thing, a kind of hopeful note to end on. This is kind of connected to the climate opinion map and also the 6 Americas. This we pulled from our climate advocacy lab. And this is showing the proportions of people who are alarmed to people who are dismissive in 2019. And just randomly, we selected Miami-Dade County, and we can see that the proportion of alarmed people to dismissive is 3.49, excuse me. So that means that for every single person who's dismissive about climate change, we have over 3 people who are alarmed, which is huge. And that's really showing that people do care about this issue way more. It's way more ubiquitous than we might sometimes be led to believe, or sometimes that we think. And it should really be an empowering visual to show that, you know, we can talk about this. We don't have to worry so much about a backlash. And the more we talk about this, as Lisa said in her part of the presentation, the more empowered we will be to act on this important issue. And you can see a lot of other counties in Florida are green here, and so that indicates that proportion is similar to that of Miami-Dade. So what we'll do now is get you on the Q&A. If you have any questions, on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A icon. If you click that, you'll be able to type in any questions that you have. And Olivia is going to call out certain questions that Lisa and I will answer for you. And thank you once again for coming today.
Thank you, Ruthie, and thank you, Lisa, for presenting such interesting and I think these are tools that can definitely be used in different subjects. So that to me is such a great way of being able to utilize these. It's not just for science teachers, but I can use in, you know, across curriculums for elementary as well as high school. So we have our first question here from Maria. She's asking, in general, what grade levels are using these tools?
Yeah, so right now we're targeting high schoolers. We feel like our material lends itself best inherently to that age group. Also in thinking about NGSS standards, the more climate change NGSS standards exist at the high school level, but especially for something like Yale Climate Connections with the podcasts, that's a really accessible way to talk about climate change and start that conversation with younger grades as well.
That's great, thanks. The next question was related to middle school. You know, do you see any way of using these resources for middle school, which I think you just answered. I definitely think that depending on where you're going with, you know, like you said in the beginning, there's a wide range of tools, and I think they can be used for different age groups. I think the podcasts are a great way of reaching a younger audience as well. I don't know if you have any other suggestions.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, I'll just say that we know of anecdotally of one classroom in Idaho, a 4th grade teacher, that has students listen to the daily radio program a couple of times a week, and they just have a bit of a discussion on it during their homeroom time. And so that's a way of using it even below the middle school level to just generate some discussion. And again, to break that climate spiral of silence and to encourage and help people feel more empowered to speak of, even in those ages.
Thank you, Lisa. Did you want to add something, Ruthie?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I completely agree with Lisa, and I think that's a really great specific anecdotal example. I think too, even the 4-question multiple choice survey that you all took, I think that could be appropriate for middle school. Especially, this might be the first time that middle schoolers are really learning or talking about climate change, and even the activity that I modeled with the climate opinion maps, some of the questions that you can select are definitely more high level and would be better for high schoolers. But some of them, like the one we did together, global warming will harm me personally, that is something that you might be able to do with middle schoolers. And maybe even if you didn't have them working independently to navigate the map model, it's something that you could do as a full class.
Great. We have a question from Leah. Do you have any activities or group projects that are listed on the website?
Yes, that's a great question. And that's actually a lot of what my role now is trying to identify the types of activities and accompanying resources that we could develop that we can give to teachers, so that it's, grab and go, lessening the burden on teachers so that they don't have to create all of these things. So we are working towards that right now. But as of yet, we don't have anything. But again, for something like the Yale Climate Connections, it's just a matter of listening to a 90-second podcast and coming up with, a couple of discussion prompts, which hopefully it wouldn't be too much of a burden, wouldn't take too much time out of your prep time.
Thank you, Ruthie. This is a question from a high school student, and she's asking, how would you suggest encouraging teachers and educators to implement these tools in their curriculum?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Veronica. I think, well, I'll just kind of keep going on the vein of the Yale Climate Connections podcast. I think I mentioned earlier that that's a really great thing to use as a do now. If teachers have a few minutes left at the end of class, if they've wrapped up early, or as Lisa was talking about, the middle school example where the teacher plays a podcast and discusses with their students a couple of times a week. It's a really quick, easy, low pressure for teachers way to incorporate our tools. I think that for the survey, again, using that as a benchmark at the beginning and end of a climate change unit is a good thing. And then the other parts of Six Americas, having students practice engaging with people of different climate beliefs, whether it's simulated or actually going out into the community and talking to their families who might have different beliefs. I think that those would be more of like full lessons or multi-day lessons. I hope that answered your question.
Great. We also have one here, which is a question that I had as well, is how often do you update the data that's on the website? So we saw that a lot of that stuff was from November of 2019. Do you guys do this every year?
Yes, let me answer that. So I'm not sure it was clear when I kind of gave the overview at the beginning, that we conduct these surveys twice a year, once in the spring, usually around mid-March or April, and then in the fall, usually in October, sometimes as late as November. So we have new results twice a year, and we issue results based on those latest findings also twice a year. So for example, right now, the spring survey is just finishing up in the field. People are responding to it nationally, and we'll have the nationally representative brand new results out either late in April and early May. And then as these tools takes a little bit longer to incorporate data points in these tools, but usually that happens at least on a yearly basis.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. Maria is asking, when the students use these resources, are they typically engaging with their own equipment, like laptops, computers? And she's asking what you might think is the most effective practical setup inside a classroom when presenting these tools.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Maria. So that, of course, will depend a lot from school to school and teacher to teacher, depending on, what access teachers and schools have to technology. It really depends. If you're looking to administer the Six Americas survey, sure, it would be amazing if every student could have their own laptop or iPad, or, if students are allowed to use their phones, or if there's a computer lab where they can work with the Yale Climate Opinion Map in partners or small groups. But for something like the podcasts, that's something that, as long as the teacher has a computer and access to some sort of audio system where the teacher can, play that audio for the whole class, that could work as well.
Great, thanks, Ruthie. There's a question from Catherine asking if the prompts that you used earlier when we were discussing the podcast, if they're on the website. I believe you sort of touched on this earlier.
Yeah, just to reiterate, sure. So as of now, no, but again, that's what we are starting to work towards. We're hoping to have kind of a store of, or not a store, but just kind of a place where teachers can go when they navigate to these sites to access, activity suggestions and discussion prompts. But in the meantime, if it's helpful at all, it really didn't take me very long at all to just identify a podcast, listen to it, and come up with just two prompts. So hopefully, even though we don't have those up and going for you now, that wouldn't be too much of a deterrent for you to use the tool yourself in the meantime.
Great. We have a great question here from Frank asking, why do you think that there's such a stark difference? Oops, what happened to it? Just disappeared. I'm not sure what happened to the question. Here's one.
I had actually just replied to it.
Okay.
So yeah, he was asking why there was such a stark difference between the percentage of Americans who feel that climate change will harm future generations, which I think is up in the 60s or 70s, versus those that think climate change will harm people now. And I think that's part of this feeling like it's a distant problem issue, right? That it's not affecting us now daily in our own lives, but there is a sense that, yeah, it's looming and it's going to affect people in the future. So, and he sort of asked a rhetorical question, saying, shouldn't we act now to prevent that harm in the future? And that, of course, is absolutely correct.
I 100% agree. Thank you, Lisa. We have a question from Juan saying, what would be the main action to improve climate change education techniques for developing countries where the lack of knowledge, resources, and motivation exist? I mean, that's a big question. I don't know if either of you would like to.
Well, I can try to just answer that in part. What we have found worldwide is that there's about 40% overall in the world that haven't ever even considered the concept and don't even recognize it as an issue or as a fact. And so there, the major challenge is just to build awareness that global warming is happening. Oftentimes what we find is that people haven't heard the term, but when you explain what it means is that temperatures are rising and it's creating different weather patterns, that people do understand that it's happening, but they don't understand that it's something that has to be addressed and dealt with, that they have the power to make a difference. And so that's where building awareness, just as a very simple matter, just educating people that this is happening, is extremely important.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And you both touched on that earlier with the statistics showing that while most Americans do believe that climate change is happening, the majority of us don't actually even talk about it with our friends or family, who are the most immediate people in our circles. And really the first step is just talking about it. And that's where education comes in. We have, let me just see here. Actually, this is a comment, and I thought this would be interesting. She says, if you guys could include project-based learning and lesson plans, teachers might be more likely to use the tools that you offer on your websites. I just want to remind everybody that you're going to be getting a follow-up email tomorrow from this webinar that has all of these resources. We can also follow up and send some of the slides that were used today. And there's a small survey in that email that you're going to get tomorrow. And that survey will really help CLEO, but also Lisa and Ruthie better understand and have an opportunity for you to provide feedback to them on what are ways that you think as educators that these tools can be used. So please take probably about 60 seconds to answer the survey that we'll be getting in your email tomorrow. We really appreciate that. I don't see any more questions. So we are actually right on time. It's 5 o'clock. So I want to thank Lisa and Ruthie for the amazing presentation today. And again, we'll be sharing all of these resources in a follow-up email. And you also have my email address in there. So if any of the participants have questions, you can email me directly and I can get in touch with Ruthie and Lisa. Do either of you have any last words that you'd like to share with the participants?
I just want to say thank you to everybody for taking the time to participate. This was very educational for me as well to understand what would be useful for the community of educators that are already sensitive to the need to teach on this. And I think this is very helpful for us moving forward. It's certainly the reason we knew that this existed, that this need existed. And so it just adds, it gives us even greater confidence that it was the right thing to hire Ruthie, who has this expertise in the educational domain, to work with us to provide some recommendations for how we can best move forward and partner more effectively with the community of educators out there that are already working so hard in this area.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Thank you everybody for attending the webinar and for your commitment to your students and to teaching about such an important issue. We really hope that this has been helpful and that you can take some of what we've covered in this webinar and use it with your students so we can all kind of make a difference together.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, CLEO has more webinars on the horizon. Next week is Earth Week, the 50th anniversary. So we've got lots of exciting online learning opportunities. We encourage you to go to our website, into our events calendar page tab. And again, you'll all get follow-up information from today's webinar as well as the recording. So thank you, everyone, and wishing everyone a safe and nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.